we are going live. I guess we're all set. Okay, good morning, everybody. This is the Senate Transportation Committee, and it is Wednesday, and we are going to continue our discussion about the T-bill. When do we have it in possession? When do we have it in here?
So first off, can you guys hear me? I'm using headphones.
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. My kid is watching Cars in the background, so I didn't want that to be distracting. So the House passed it on third reading on Friday. I am surprised it wasn't referred to your committee yesterday, so I expect that it'll be referred to.
Might have been.
I didn't hear it, but maybe we were listening well enough.
I checked on the website and it has not been referred yet, so you didn't miss it.
All right, well, welcome Anthea this morning, and we're going to start our discussion, I guess. And we know pretty much what's in it, I believe. And, so we'll turn it over to you, Anthea. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm just going to start at the top. Most of the sections that you haven't gone through yet are actually the earlier sections, since those are the ones that dealt with appropriations and authorizations. But you now will have the bill. The copy room should have delivered copies to your desks. And then I'll do more detail on the sections you haven't seen yet. And then for the sections that you've seen already, I think you can go through pretty quickly. And then once I finish, I think the plan for the balance of your week is to hear from Chris, who has so many spreadsheets and charts that explain all of the dollars, and then take it from there as to what other testimony you want from the agency for sections you haven't heard and other witnesses. So with that, I'm going to put up the bill. It is posted to your committee page as well.
This is the one we're following, this packet here.
Yeah, so I gave you the official version, since that has line numbers. And then since it was a committee bill, there were very few changes that were made on the floor, and we'll just skip over the strikeout language. So hopefully everyone can see this bill is passed by the House. So starting at the beginning with section 1, this is that very, very important section that basically attaches that white binder to the back of the bill. So wherever the bill goes, that white binder is going, and everything in that white binder, as the transportation program is updated, is adopted, unless it's amended in the T-bill itself. So that is what happens through section 1A.
So Anthea, did the House amend anything in the plan?
Yes.
Okay. I would have thought so, but.
Yeah, there are some amendments, and they're early on in the bill. So we'll see them in the first, I think they're all in the first 10 sections. So subsection B, these are your definition sections. Most of them are the same definitions that you've seen in the T-bill for the past several years. Except there are 3 new ones that the Agency of Transportation thinks should be there going forward. They're here specifically to deal with some prioritization when it comes to some of the town highway bridge projects. And that is a change that is made to the transportation program through the T-bill, but it was done at the request of the Agency of Transportation, and it had to do with when some guidance for how some of the new initiatives through the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, was going to be available. And that's adding the definitions for candidate project, development and evaluation, or D&E project, or in subdivision 5, front of book project. And these definitions are almost identical, and they are identical substantively to the definitions that if you go all the way to the end of the white binder in that glossary and definition section, that's where these definitions come from. But they're to describe the different priorities and stages that projects are in. And you'll see where they come into play when we get to section 7.
So this language, we've sort of talked about it, but this is actually making in writing the different definitions of candidate or D&E or front of the book. Is that?
Yep.
Okay. We haven't done that before then.
My understanding is you have not done it before, but since the transportation program is adopted and the definitions are in the glossary, I think that they were sort of adopted through section 1A in the past.
All right. Or they've sort of done there, but this is making it very explicit.
Yep.
But using essentially the same definitions.
Exactly. So other definitions that you'll see here are the definitions for the different types of chargers, level 1 charger, level 2 and charger, and level 3 charger. This was included for the most part because all 3 of the governor's recommended electric vehicle supply equipment prioritization initiatives were included in the T-bill. 2 of them were pulled out and put into the big bill. So these 3 definitions are also in the big bill now, just applicable to one section. And we'll get to the different amounts of money that are siloed off for purposes of charging stations. But that's why the definitions for the different types are included in this definition section. And that's going to take us to the end of section 1, unless there are any questions.
Yeah, I do have, you make reference to the fiscal stuff that Chris has done, and he's done fiscal notes. And someone, I didn't copy it off to take a look. Perhaps we could, Jeannie, can you arrange to have someone who is at the State House copy that fiscal note so that we have it?
I'm not sure.
Drew did some fiscal notes, or maybe we could ask joint fiscal.
So I think what makes sense, Senator Kitchell, is Chris has been working with House Transportation to get some of the charts printed out on larger pieces of paper. How about I coordinate with Chris and Lori Morse, the committee assistant for House Transportation, and they can facilitate getting you copies of the fiscal note and then all of Chris's charts on pieces of paper that should be more readable than an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper.
Wonderful, thank you, Anthea. It's just, I know that he sent us an email with the attachments, and it would be, just like we have this, it would be really good to have copies. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, and I will actually just text him now and he can work on that. And I'm sure they'll magically show up while you are going through the rest of the bill.
And while we're here and we're got charges on here, and I know it's gonna sound strange coming from Ingalls, but at any time that we can put a better charger in first, let's try to do that first. I'd rather spend more money now than try to go back later and retro upgrade it. I mean, just talking with you, Senator Perchlik, you know, talking about the charges and all of that stuff and the time frame and all of that stuff, and then seeing some stuff online about how long the lines are and how long people have to wait to go through there. I'd rather spend the money now than try to upgrade it later. I think it's best to spend it when you right now versus I think it's more cost effective. So I will be pushing on that anytime that I see a charger that we can upgrade.
Yes. That's an investment that's pretty damn short term, but
Right.
what you're talking about is a much more.
If we can spend, if we can go to some of these chargers and we gotta spend another $25,000 to upgrade it to the higher one, I'm all over that, because I know it's gonna cost more when we go back to do it later.
The other option, if we didn't agree with the House on that, is the utilities to upgrade the grid. That's another, and I'll get some figures on that. So there are other ways you can keep that money in the climate arena, but use it for investments that are going to give you a longer term
Right.
benefit.
And we don't have to go back and visit. We talk about that in institutions all the time when they're putting these buildings up, and at least running the conduits down to at least get the stuff outside the building so that when they are gonna put the charging stations in, they don't have to go and revamp all those buildings to do that. So.
Take it out of the bicycle money. Here.
Well, you don't need to put as much in bicycles. That's a choice. We had 50,000, I think, last year.
I'm not-
50 million, 50,000 to $1 million is a fairly significant.
Just for the committee, I received this almost 6-8 months, almost a year ago. Like law of safety, it's an issue across the country, just not here, just here.
See, you're ahead of the times.
Bentley University, Department of Law and Taxation, bike safety equipment and uniform bike safety equipment. I received that, I kept it, and I was looking at it the other day, but anyway, that's another subject. Okay, yes.
I don't know how this works to officially put it on the table, but I too am questioning those $200 rebates on e-bikes. As much as I love one, I was in Costco last night and
Every night.
I'm like Norm there. But the e-bike that I bought for my daughter dropped from 380 to 350. So the prices are going down. The e-bikes are, yeah, I took a photo.
All your stuff in your store is going up and the Costco's going down.
In other words, you just do it for 200 plus 50.
Oh, I'm gonna get my $30 back. I love Costco. They always they match.
He's got the platinum card.
Geez, you got your $30 back.
It is. I don't think the $200 rebate is really.
Anthea, sorry about that. Go right ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So now we're getting to,
Different ideas about how to spend this
Yeah.
Well, exactly.
money.
That's good.
in
I have
ways-
another proposal.
Okay.
Oh, good. Good. We,
That's what we're here for.
and this leads right into the next section.
Uh-huh.
So-
I have a-
Okay, go ahead.
Can I ask a style question? Why is section 2 italicized?
So this is the formatting for when you're looking at the official version of a bill. If you look at the unofficial version, it'll look like a normal bill. The reason why I'm walking through the official version is there's very few changes that were made on the floor. That's what you see in the italicized text and the strikeout that is up on the screen right now. I really like the fact that the official version has line numbers, which I think helps me tell you where I am in the walkthrough. But if you look at the unofficial version, which is also available on the website, it won't be italicized. And obviously in the final version of the bill, which I think will come through a conference committee report, nothing will be italicized or in red.
There's not line numbers to that. So anytime there's not line numbers and it's italicized, it was added on the floor.
Yep, it was a change that was made on the floor. So if we're looking at the progression of the T-bill, it was introduced by House Transportation. It went to House Appropriation, and they had 4 instances of amendment, all having to do with either eliminating an appropriation, like with the $1,050,000 for VAST, or moving something from the T-bill over to the big bill or changing a funding source. So there were 4 instances of amendment that came from House Appropriations. And then based on a change in funding source for the electric bicycle incentives, that $1 million that Senator Kitchell was just talking about, because House Appropriations changed that from being ARPA to general fund, the attempt to link it to criteria in terms of being aligned with the definitions of low and moderate income household in the ARPA guidance was able to be eliminated. So instead of linking it to 80% of state median income, the electric bicycle incentives in the version of the T-bill that came out of the House just continues the criteria that was used for the $50,000 for this fiscal year for those $200 incentives. And that is being eligible under any of the criteria for the incentive programs for new plug-in electric vehicles. And those are linked to adjusted gross income at different levels based on whether you file jointly or just as a single individual. So those are the changes that you'll see in italics.
Okay, so we need to go to page 9 then.
Yep. So the changes that you're going to see in section 2 coming from House Appropriations are that in the governor's recommend, there was $19.25 million going to charging stations. And it was broken out as $6.25 million for level 3 chargers along the state highway network, $10 million going through the Agency of Commerce and Community Development for multi-unit dwellings, workplaces, and community venues and attractions. And that was a mix of different charger types, with the community venues having levels 2 and 3, and then the workplaces and the multi-unit dwellings having level 1s and level 2s. And then $3 million for level 2 chargers, I believe it was, or level 1 and level 2 at state parks and fishing access areas. What House Appropriations did in their amendment was they maintained those funding levels. They changed the funding sources. So what was proposed to be used as ARPA was switched to general fund, and they moved out the $13 million that was not going through the Agency of Transportation. So in the red italicized language, you will only see the $6.25 million for the fast chargers, the level 3 chargers along the state highway network. And that $6.25 million is $2 million ARPA and 4.25 million that's split between the IIJA money, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure money, 4.25 million, with the 20% for the non-federal match of that 4.25 coming from transportation fund dollars. So 2 million ARPA, approximately 80,000 T-fund, and then the balance is federal NEVI money. So that's your 6.25 million. And where those chargers are placed is in accordance with the goals that you established in the T-bill last year as they are amended in this bill. And we talked about the amendment, how instead of it being within 1 mile, within 5 miles driving, not as the crow flies from exits, that's dropping to 1 mile. And the distance between the charging stations along the state highway network is going to be 25 miles as opposed to 50 miles. And you'll see that when we get to section 3. The balance of section 2 has.
This links back, and obviously this is taking it out of this T-bill. But we spent a lot of time on that language about reimbursement and the state charging fees. If in fact, in the other bill, they pulled out the multi-dwelling and the 3 million for level 1 and 2 at state parks. I mean, to me, that's just a further indication that it won't be long before that whole section is going to be irrelevant, that we're going to have a network of charging and the ability to charge directly without getting into the state charging fees and reimbursement and that whole convoluted discussion that we had earlier. So I was just connecting that particular recommendation around funding with the discussion we had last week on that other language.
Yeah, and that's later in the bill, that's sections 50 and 51, and that there were no changes made on the floor. So there's still that 3 reporting requirement.
Yeah, well.
And Thea, can you go through the other vehicle supply equipment funding that's now in the budget? That's the 3 million for multifamily?
So it's 10 million for multi-unit dwellings, workplaces, state offices, and community attractions and venues. 10 million, one very large pot there. And then it's 3 million for state parks and fishing access areas. And one of the things that might need to change in terms of the fishing access areas is because of the Dingell-Johnson Act, which provides federal money to establish fishing access areas and a prioritization of usage. If there are concerns from the Department of Fish and Wildlife that they will not be able to ensure through some sort of technology fix or where they're located in fishing access parking lots, that they might wish to put those charging stations in just access areas in general. So it might be that the word fishing needs to be struck in the T-bill. So it would then be at state parks and access areas that are maintained by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. But if you're looking at the money that's not in the T-bill that has to do with charging stations, it's 13 million, all general fund, 10 million to ACCD, to multi-unit dwellings, workplaces, community attractions, state offices, and then 3 million to state parks and fishing access areas.
I'm very confused. Yes.
I can see a ton of money, just talking to the committee, I can see a ton of money trying to get this into the fishing accesses. Every one I go by is remote as hell. I mean, and I don't know if, I don't know.
20 miles.
They don't know. They don't have the infrastructure there that we're gonna have to build all that new. I don't know, maybe we need to be focusing on places that already have the infrastructure already in place. So we can get more of these charging stations out there versus building, let's do that in the next phase.
And do you know if they took testimony in the House about that issue? Because I had a similar thought that
I believe they heard from both commissioners of Fish and Wildlife and Parks and Forest Parks and Recreation. I think they heard from both commissioners.
Transportation did, or appropriations?
Transportation.
Even though it's not transportation, how did it end up in the T-bill?
I think, so the appropriation was always going to need to be in the big bill, but the authorization language, I think the direction I got from Michelle and the administration was electric vehicle supply equipment, keep the 19.25 in the T-bill for the authorization and the direction about where they should be placed. If we're looking historically at where money for electric vehicle supply equipment has been in, it's been in the T-bill, it's been in the capital bill, and it's been in the big bill. So it seems to move around, and that was a last final decision that House Appropriations made at 9 o'clock on the Friday before the bill was introduced.
Michelle, anytime you think of something that you can go ahead, raise your hand, comment. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
I think it's cleaner the way they did it. And to keep the 13, which is ACCD related and state parks, because those are not usually areas of the budget that the transportation committee gets. They all come into the big bill eventually, but how that would work and what funding source you use. So, so they didn't change the amount, they just changed really where things ended up. Although, okay, so transportation actually took testimony on funding that ultimately didn't get in the T-bill at all.
Yeah, so the authorization language was always there, and it referenced, and the language was the same for all of the amounts, that the amount as appropriated in the fiscal year 2023 budget. So House Transportation was never in any iteration of its language dictating the funding source for that 13 million. And it was the guidance as to where it was supposed to be, the types of chargers it was supposed to be. And that language modified by House Appropriations is what ended up in the big bill.
Go ahead, Senator.
And Thea, you mentioned that unless there's a technology fix regarding the fishing access areas, I'm curious, did the House, I don't know enough about decentralized energy capture and charging stations. Like, is there such technologies out there? We're a rural state, and I'm wondering if there's certain configurations where you don't need to be attached to the power grid, but instead could have solar panels charged to a battery that could then be used in these remote locations.
So that is not the issue that I was alluding to. So under the Dingell-Johnson Act, and you're going to want to hear from Mike O'Grady if you have more questions about this, but very.
You can do it on the interstates. There's some federal prohibition in terms of what you can do with those federally funded fishing access.
Yes. So the concern is if you have it sort of showing up, let's pretend it's ChargePoint, and it shows up on ChargePoint's map of there's a charging station here, are people who are not going to be fishing going to pull in and try and use that charging station? If there would be a way to limit who can use the charging station to someone who was fishing or someone who had a fishing access, a fishing license potentially, if that can make it so that there is a limitation on who has access to the charging station. That was what the technology piece was. I do not know if testimony was taken or consideration made in terms of how are you going to get the electricity to the charging station? I've heard talk of having this be in conjunction with solar panels.
Nanthea, did they take any testimony about the future of electric watercraft, water vessels as we call them here?
I do not know if testimony was taken on that, not when I was there, but there could be a connection to electric boats. I know that's something that some people have expressed interest in.
And I just saw, I watched a video just for your guys is on where I would have said before, there's no way that that's ever going to happen in our lifetime. But there are electric motors out there now that are very, very, very impressive with the range and everything that they have. So we're at a one, yeah, very, very impressive. No, actually big boats. I mean, they have them now where.
Or like the pontoon boats, you're not trying to go that fast.
Yeah, like, yeah, they have them now where they're in the 200 horsepower class, and range is very, very acceptable on 6 or 7 hour ranges, and very, very, very neat. So
that would argue for having charging stations.
And it would, but it just.
It's kind of the future.
But just in the places to where I think there ought to be some limits of set of how much infrastructure you have to get bill to get it there. I mean, yeah, there are places probably like in Newport already where they have, but when I go, 20 other ones going through my brain that I drive by all the time. There's just nothing there. I mean, oh, we're on the reservoir out there, up where you are. I mean, I don't know, just on it goes. I mean, I'm very proud of what we have for accesses to our bodies of water, but boy, there's some most of them are very remote, and I think there ought to be some. Yeah, there ought to be some considerations about how much infrastructure you have to build before you can get there.
If we do incentives for ATVs, I think we should add electric water skis.
There you go, electric water skis there.
They have those.
Yeah, yeah.
I would put our grid improvement and a couple of the
Come
other.
on, you don't like to have fun.
If I had a constituent say, you use public money to subsidize, and first of all, e-snow machines are relatively new technology, and we know that people with limited incomes as cars are already in the second, they're in the secondhand market.
We put you on the head of the snowmobiles, you're on that committee there, so you've been appointed that.
It doesn't matter, my whole life is setting priorities around competing funding, and
You have the expertise.
well, if somebody came to your store and said, did you provide a snowmobile subsidy to this family? And I know that certainly that additional money, the UI money, people have said, and I know people that are out in the field have said, it really did accelerate the purchase of snow machines. There's no question about it. It's a matter of, out of all the competing needs, whether we're talking about the improvement of the grid, whether we're talking about the network of charging stations, if we're looking at how you get long-term, and that's what we've been talking about,
Right.
transformative investments that give long-term improvement, then where would you put your first dollar? That, to me, is the question we always have to be asking ourselves.
You're gonna be almost like what the state colleges are, not to drag them into them, but when the state colleges were focused on individual, like Linden for what they did, or Castleton for what they did, is when they tried to be all to everybody's when they ran into problems. And I agree with you, Senator Kitchell. I think we need to be transformative and we need to be impactful in that way, because these funds aren't here forever.
I agree. Michelle, can I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
Michelle, the administration of this, the money that's going to AOT, this 6.2, is that going to be administrated by contract or by AOT? Or do you know yet?
By contract or by what?
Just by staff, AOT staff?
That one is going to probably be administered by AOT staff, because we're looking at public-private partnership type arrangements for deploying the roadway network EV charging, whereby we might work with either, we're going to be in conversations with gas station owner chains, and the other option might be that we work with the providers, ChargePoint, whoever, and they just lease from from locations that meet the criteria within there. So we're looking at a variety of models, so I imagine we will be implementing those specifically.
Okay, all right, anything else? Go ahead.
Okay. So finishing the balance of your subsections, subsection B is the purpose section. We're including this for the ARPA piece and linking it to the travel, tourism, and hospitality industries as having been impacted. Subsection C deals with administration.
Oh, the 2 million ARPA, that's what you're linking that language to.
Exactly.
Okay.
Subsection C, administration expenses. This is what Senator Perchlik and Michelle were just talking about. As this is written, there's 15% of the total amount available that has gone out in grants. It could be that if the intent of the Agency of Transportation is to do this through public-private partnerships, that this 15% administration should just be 15% of the $6.25 million and not linking it to grants going out that linkage might be more appropriate for the pots of money that ACCD, for example, is
So
using.
that triggers another thought, and that was, remember, we used similar language to Capstone. And when they were having trouble with the grants going out, and they were spending an awful lot of staff time, administrative time. And so maybe we should take a look at that, not linking it to the grants in light of that experience.
Yep.
I'm just throwing it out. I'm great at connecting points, but we did deal with that in the budget adjustment so that it didn't pose that problem. But would that be a problem, do you think, this language, or should we consider modifying it?
Well, the way that language is structured is up to 15%, I believe, and
Of the amount that is distributed in grant awards. That's the issue. It's not of the appropriation, it's all related to grant awards.
okay,
That's my question
Yeah.
is whether we should say 15% of the 6.2 can be used for admin.
We can take notes on this, you know.
no, that, I think either way would be fine, it achieves the same end. And the idea being that, to the extent that the admin money is not needed, it goes back into grant awards.
Okay, well, it's just oftentimes you're doing a lot of administrative work before you ever issue a grant.
Yes.
That's my only point, is if you're allowed to use 15% of the appropriation, then that allows that upfront and doesn't link it into, because you're spending money before you're doing any grants, and by tying it into grants, you kind of got a sequence issue around your spending before you're granting. All right, we'll make a note.
In the outreach, there's the subsections 2C of the 11 I assume that is part of the 15%, or would that be separate?
Well,
For costs of so,
yes and no.
let me seems like it would be.
Let me explain. So we, as you know, we've been working with Drive Electric Vermont, I'm sorry, for the record, Michelle Boomhauer, Vermont Agency of Transportation. So as you know, we've been working with Drive Electric Vermont for the past 10 plus years.
Instant service.
10 plus years, and they have been doing a combination of technical assistance, research, consumer information, and outreach about electric vehicles and electrification. So we are moving into a phase where we still need them to do this work, body of work for us. And the 2 million that's represented in the proposal would be spread out over what we're anticipating to be a 3-year time frame, because we anticipated it to be ARPA related.
Right.
In terms of the money within the 15% that goes to the contractor will, or contractors, depending on how we do this, they may also, have some marketing outreach coordination that occurs that would be supportive of the other efforts that are going on.
The question I've got, all of that would be funded out of the 15% admin.
So there's 15% admin for the specific programs, and then there's a $2 million request for Drive Electric Vermont to continue the work they're doing.
That's separate, or that's part of
That's
the?
separate, that's
Yeah,
separate.
So that's somewhere else in the bill.
So, but in other words, not only are you getting the grant awards, but you're also costs associated with promoting state-run electric vehicle supply, grant programs, translation, community outreach and education. That's why I think the 15% of the appropriation makes sense, because you've got an awful lot of activity that,
Yes.
But you're saying, Michelle, that the outreach marketing will be done by Drive Electric under that contract, or a good part of that?
It'll be both. And so that's why, the number is set at 15%. A lot of this is new startup activity still, and so we're sort of making our way. So rather than I think as Senator Kitchell alluded to, come in with a number that is not adequate and then have to come back because we couldn't launch the program. We felt 15% was a reasonable starting place, maybe more than we need, in which case we can direct it back into the grants.
The 15% isn't the issue. It's tying 50% of grant awards as opposed to 15% of the appropriation. Normally, we work based on the appropriation. Because as I said, you're going to be spending money, incurring costs before you ever give out a grant. So and that would argue for all you're talking about to get rid of the grant award and have that just say, here's a grant, it's going to cost, here's an appropriation, it's going to cost money to administer it, make it 15% of the appropriation.
And Thea, can you tell me what section that 2 million to drive electric is in, or do you know?
The 2 million to drive electric is in section 4F. And that's going to be at the bottom of page 14 into the top of page 15.
Right there.
You can go back to wherever we were.
No, wait a minute. So then does 15% any single authorization?
So section 4 has to do with the vehicle incentive
When you're
program.
talking about authorization, you're talking about, you're using different terms.
So the 15% for the grant, so in section 2, because there was the possibility that money would go out as grants or just as the agency purchasing charging stations or public-private partnerships, linking it to the grant awards. Going back sort of from a historic perspective with what happened with Capstone was in the original iteration of the incentive programs, I believe there was $150,000 that was made available for administration expenses. And that amount was entirely expended before, as Senator Kitchell was mentioning, it takes administration time before you get any money out the door in a grant. All that money was expended before Mileage Smart started giving out incentives. And then there was money left over from one fiscal year that was carried forward. And a decision was made at that point, I can't remember what committee it was made in, to link the administration expenses to then going forward, the amount that's given out in a grant award. The vehicle incentive programs in section 4, which we haven't gotten to yet, but that's going to be the money for the incentive program for new PEVs, Mileage Smart, Replace Your Ride, the e-bikes, and then e-recreation, which is snowmobiles and ATVs. That is saying that all of that money is to go out in grants. It's not for like the Agency of Transportation to purchase an electric vehicle. So that's why there's a difference in the phrasing between the two. But in listening to Michelle explain how they think they're going to go about getting the $6.25 million out the door to get charging stations along highway networks, Senator Kitchell, I think your point is extremely valid that perhaps it should just be 15% of the $6.25 million, not linking it to grants, because it could be that there is no money in grants if it's done through a public-private partnership, and it allows them to have the administration expenses at the beginning. And then Senator Perch, like your questions about the 2 million for Drive Electric, that's in this different section. It's in section 4, which deals with all of the vehicle incentive programs. Hopefully that provides some clarity and a potential path forward on the administration expenses in section 2.
So can we agree that we just want to get rid of linking it to grant awards and maybe the appropriation so that we can?
Do I hear that consensus?
I'm good, I'm fine. I'm good with that.
All right, so we can.
Anytime you want to jump in here, we're just going through a rough draft.
Just a fly on the wall, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Do we a little quicker next time? I think I thought it and he was here.
I went 43 years without needing glasses, then I became a state senator.
Yeah, that's why I brought mine back out.
You must be one of the younger.
You're a newcomer. You're a newcomer.
Huh?
I'm the new guy.
You're 43?
44 now. Needed glasses starting last session. Chris Root's spreadsheets.
By 17.
This one here is a little small. This one here is a little small.
I apologize for that. I can make that one there.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Jane, you brought up something.
No, I just want to close that out. There were agreement, we wanted to change the language so that if,
Do I hear the consensus that at least we can tentatively set,
Yes.
and then we can revisit if we have to, but it's good to get some of these things checked out.
closed out, yeah.
As long as Anthea understands.
Yeah,
I think
I understand.
perfectly.
okay, so that's a tentative agreement that we'll have this all compiled together, we'll revisit it again. Okay, go right ahead.
Okay, so subsection D, this is your carry forward language. This tracks language that is usually in the Budget Adjustment Act for carry forwards, saying that this can be used for the same purpose if it's unexpended at the end of the fiscal year. And then subdivision 2 is your, I would say, just expediency language. So it says every reasonable effort shall be made to obligate and deploy the monies that are authorized to get charging stations out on the state highway network in the next fiscal year.
Okay, we'll put that in there for you, okay? All
I
right.
will- I
Yeah,
am sorry that you are now hearing that background noise.
Oh, that's perfectly fine. That's great.
uh-huh,
Weigh it in, that's right.
yeah. Apparently, there's agreement on that, that change.
Okay, yep.
Okay, and then subsection E, this is your outreach and marketing language. And you talked about that already, but it has to do with making the grant program for electric vehicle supply equipment known. It could be that this language also should get tinkered a little bit if the Agency of Transportation thinks that they're going to be pursuing more of a public-private partnership approach and less of a having grants go out. When this language was added to the T-bill, it was covering all 3 of those different silos of money. And this outreach and marketing language is in the big bill for the 13 million that's going to ACCD and A&R.
Isn't that kind of redundant? Because in C, you've already got, including translation, interpretation, community outreach, and education. It seems like, I guess maybe it's outreach and marketing. Is that what makes it different? It seems like it's kind of redundant.
It is redundant. The language in subsection C has to do with the fact that the administration expenses can go to this purpose. And then subsection E is saying, and you need to actually do this. So yes, it is redundant, but it is saying you can use some of this money for this purpose. And this is what you need to do in terms of outreach and marketing. And it was something that House Transportation members felt strongly about.
Let's take it out for general purpose. We gotta have something. I don't know. I redundant language. It's just, what more does that give? Or why don't we just make C a little bit more expansive? And I don't know. It just seems like people love language and studies and task force.
Okay.
So let it go.
Sure, yeah.
I can work on a modified subsection C when I'm doing that other language on the administration expenses. I'm going to be in the section anyway.
I just think since it's in 2 different places, it's a lot better to have it one and
You can combine it.
and combine it. All right. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're into a section that you already talked about. This is amending the goals from the last T-bill to change it from 5 miles to 1 mile and 50 miles to 25 miles. Section 4 is new language. This is the authorizations for the amounts that are appropriated for the different vehicle incentive programs.
Is yours? And the
Give him like he can say words.
Sorry.
We understand what motherhood's all about.
What it's worth,
Multitasking brought, to a high level.
what it's worth, Anthea, they get a lot easier, but they don't get cheaper.
Understand.
So in the,
And they can become adults and you still don't.
Jane's still going through that now.
Right. Yeah.
My son dines out regularly.
Well, yeah, who gave him the credit card?
I did.
I was gonna say, you better be careful about that wedding. You're probably up to almost $2,500.
Hey, you get a
Buy that much.
No,
That would be-
no, what are you gonna do
Some
with it?
months that would be cheap, right? Takes money to ski in
Buy a
Alaska.
better car than she does.
Yeah, I just paid it this morning.
Okay, go ahead.
So these amounts are all at the governor's recommend level. And what appropriations did was make all of this be general fund as opposed to ARPA. The governor's recommend had it at ARPA. And the concern there is if you're going to use ARPA, it needs to either be linked to the travel, tourism, hospitality, though there are many ways to use ARPA money, but the links that were thought to be here were travel, tourism, and hospitality, or low and moderate income households. And these are established programs that did not directly align with that federal guidance. And House Appropriations made the decision to have all of these funding sources be general fund.
Are
So
we swapping the funds out? I mean, we swap in from ARPA to general fund and then finding someplace else for that 12 million to go to be used in ARPA?
I feel very confident that House Appropriations found a way to spend all of the available money and that Senate Appropriations will have a different proposal for how to spend all of the available
Over
money.
60 million.
I guess my ask is probably a new guy question. Are they not gonna go find another way to spend another $12 million that we don't have someplace
We
else?
just swapped it.
Okay,
We
that's,
just swapped it. We
okay.
do that.
okay.
And because their conditions with the ARPA and general fund is state dollars, so
Right.
people need to realize these are all state revenues that are being obligated here because the federal laws question whether it's a permissible use. So there was a lot of swapping.
Okay.
And we swapped in the BAA, so.
Right.
So,
There's no concerns with the swapping. It's completely legitimate and expected to be done.
It's not really swapping, it's just swapping.
it's swapping the appropriate, no, it's perfectly all right. I mean, it's how we do it in the appropriations process. And it's a way of making sure that ARPA money is being appropriated for activities or whatever that are permissible under the federal rules.
Yeah.
And that's what was the issue here, was the proposal to use ARPA funds raised the question, did this meet the federal requirements for the use of ARPA? And there was and that was what the governor proposed, but on closer examination, there was concern that in fact it did not. And rather than running the risk of a disallowance, they used general fund, and then that would free up ARPA money that maybe general fund was being used for, but it was a permissible ARPA use. So
Right.
that's what's happening here, is to give the greatest assurance possible that we are not using the ARPA money in a way that would create some kind of clawback or disallowance in the
The
future.
interesting part is when all this federal money runs out, what's the reaction gonna be? Because this is gonna be,
Well,
future, I don't know what's gonna, appropriation chair is gonna have to answer because all this money that's come in and spent here and there and everywhere, and now you're gonna have to live without it in the future.
and I think the word that you have to stay focused on is transformational. You have to make sure that that money isn't something that's gonna be asked for after it's.
Oh, yeah.
You have
It
to
was
be,
supposed to be a one-time deal.
Right.
But it's not gonna be the case.
Well, that's the message that we keep trying to get across in appropriations. And the other thing that is really hard is state revenues have been greatly impacted by, you put $10 billion into the Vermont economy, and it's gonna have an impact. People are purchasing the consumption. So we've seen surpluses in the education fund because of the fact, all the sales tax and 25% of rooms and meals and a third of purchase and use all goes into the education fund. But we've seen it on the general fund side as well. But once we get through this and we start unwinding, the economists are saying our general fund growth is 2%. And so we have got to be very, very careful, but the world around us is still saying, look at all that federal money. Look, now's the time that we need to, stand in line. So the list of requests that we are getting
Right.
For spending, and I can tell you now that the House passed the budget or the T fund is passed, everybody who didn't get what they wanted on the House side are coming over and saying,
Well, it's a lot of shops.
Yeah, but that's where for example, on the grid upgrade, request came from, because the House put in some money, but they felt more was needed. So that's what we're seeing playing out here. You have to be careful that we're not building a base that we can't, once we get out of this economic environment and this huge slug of federal dollars,
Well, I'm saying
that
next
we
year, you're
can,
gonna see a difference.
we can sustain it.
Go ahead, Senator.
Either Anthea or Michelle, the governor's recommend didn't have the e-bike, but it did have the e-recreation incentive program.
It did have the e-bikes. It had the e-bikes in at $1 million, and it had e-recreation separately in at $1 million. Do I have that right?
I had that discussion with them yesterday. I said, I don't like that program. I like to take it out, but that was my discussion.
Well, my question is, do you know if the thinking of the administration was, since it was ARPA, since they were trying to make a tie to tourism, they said, oh, what can we use it that's ARPA eligible? Let's do e-bikes and e-recreation. Or was it the other way around? It's like, oh my God, we have to do e-bikes and e-recreation first, and then let's do ARPA? Or was it kind of only because of the ARPA qualifications that these were proposed by the administration? Does that make sense?
Yes, I would say that decision was made outside of my realm, so I can't speak to that.
I guess the question is, do you have a comment from the administration, how strongly they feel about this? Or is that also something you don't want to?
She's gonna defend the governor's budget.
Well, I know that.
Yes.
But sometimes the way they answer, it gives you a hint.
How much was the bike incentive?
50,000.
50,000.
50,000 to $1 million is a fairly significant. The question then becomes one of prioritization.
Yeah, back to that.
And
Yeah.
the same is true with E.
Well, and I look at it like this, and I keep it within the realm of what we're talking about. If we're tying that $1 million to tourism, I'd rather be trying to put that $1 million tied to tourism to put a charging station up into the farthest reaches of the state where people are going for tourism, and to push the more charging stations up into that area. We're not using it for electric snow machines nor groomers, but we are using it for the people who are going up there to use those trails. And so they should have the ability to charge the stations in the far reaches, whether it's in northwest, southeast, northeast, wherever.
So I guess I'm gonna put a question mark by these two things at this time, because I think there's some other things later in the that we might want
Yeah,
more
we
money.
can rush that. I think
That's right. We're gonna have different priorities, I
Right,
think.
right.
We're already articulating where we would see.
Senator Chitton?
I just want to completely agree with what Senator Ingles just said. What I see are transformational, I hear one-time capital investments, and that's where I see chargers a better fit than a $200 rebate on e-bikes. Because that goes out to the consumers, they get that for that one time, but got this money.
My only issue with electric bike, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, is they're not replacing a gasoline engine bike. That the cars, you're trying to get rid of the climate control, I understand that. The bikes, they're assuming you're gonna be used for more work-related issues. People are gonna take it to work, I guess. Because it's not to help the air quality, because there's no gasoline engine bikes. If you want to replace motorcycles, I don't want to go there either, but that's a different story. The bikes are brand new, so when you're buying a bike for $1,000, $200, I mean, come on.
$350 at Costco.
Yeah, $250.
What has been the experience with our 50,000?
That program has not launched yet.
So we're multiplying how many times a program that we haven't even started having experience.
Yeah.
I agree, question mark. I think.
Question mark there. Okay, let's go ahead, Anthea.
Okay, can you hear me? I switched my audio source.
Sounds good.
So these amounts are 12 million for the incentive program for new PEVs. That's the one that's based on adjusted gross income and is only new vehicles, all electric or hybrid electric. 3 million for Mileage Smart. These are the used high efficiency vehicles. This is the program that is administered through Capstone. 3 million for Replace Your Ride. This was the one that was created in the T-bill last year that incentivizes swaps, and you need to have a vehicle taken out of commission. And then there's sort of a package of incentives that you can get in exchange for that. The e-bike program.
Anthea, it seemed like the e-bikes was part of that Replace Your Ride
So
last year.
It's also eligible under replace your rent, and you could send that as a separate one, just for
So
that.
that's what I'm thinking. We're creating two different,
One, you have to get rid of a vehicle, one, you can just get a bike.
oh,
So in the T-bill
so
last
we
year,
need to just get a bike. Okay, so
What's the incentive? The incentive of 12 million, is that for new electric vehicles? And does it go according to your earnings that you get a rebate?
Yeah.
There's a cap,
yeah,
There's a cap, so.
and there's a cap on the vehicle price.
Okay, I'll have to understand that better. So, okay, there's a cap on the vehicle, I think it was 40 some.
It was 40, but they proposed to move it to 45.
Okay, that was it. And you're also your earning ability, what you get for each.
Yeah.
Okay.
and that's where I have my amendment, and when we're talking about mileage smart, and we can get to it later. But we had testimony about the fleet vehicles coming up for sale, and they had an agreement with the Reach Up to help families that are trying to get to work and off assistance, but also having those vehicles available for the vocational rehabilitation program that helps people with disabilities get to work. And then the other was having those vehicles third on the list to go to Capstone to be used to as part of Replace Mileage Smart. So it was a way of taking those used, that supply of vehicles and giving first dibs to those three programs in that order. So Anthea did an amendment, just, which we can talk about later, but I just wanted to let you know that on the Mileage Smart piece, there was a connection.
Okay. All right.
okay, so the e-bikes, this language was amended slightly by House Transportation. And that was, instead of having it be self-certifying at 80% of state median income, which was something that was driven by the thought that this might be funded through ARPA, to instead maintaining what you need to self-certify to under the current pot of money, the $50,000 that's available in the current fiscal year. And that's self-certifying that you are eligible for an incentive under any of the tiers for the incentive program for new PEVs. And that's the program that has different incentive amounts based on your adjusted gross income and the type of vehicle that you're getting, all electric or hybrid electric. And that would be eligibility for the e-bikes under any of the eligibilities for the incentive program for new PEVs.
Yeah, bikes were covered, and snowmobiles, but no boats.
No boats. Your e-recreation language is in subsection E, and this is just for electric snowmobiles and electric ATVs.
We're taking it out anyway.
Yeah, we're gonna spend it, but
But there's lots of boats in Vermont, I'll tell you that. And they're gas engine or whatever they are.
Usually like, seems like to me, the boat engines I've been on are single stroke, or just the emissions control not to be, seem to be as
That,
just, yeah. It's been-
okay, go ahead.
Okay, so then House Appropriations took out the purpose section. That was only there because of the ARPA piece. And since it's general fund, it's not necessary. And same with the language to notwithstand the eligibility criteria. The concern was that if ARPA was used, then the incentive criteria that existed based on income wouldn't align with the federal guidelines. Administration expenses, it's that 15% of any single authorization, not linked to the grant amounts, but all of the money is supposed to be going out in grants. And then the $2 million for continuing the public-private partnership with Drive Electric. And you'll see the same language about outreach, consumer education, translation and interpretation services that you saw in the earlier section on the electric vehicle chargers.
We know $2 million is for administration. How do we know that? That's some figure that came up.
So Senator Mott, the $2 million here would be for Drive Electric Vermont to undertake the consumer awareness, the research we need and technical assistance. They develop and assist us in like helping prepare information for all of you for consideration. They work, basically with, like, if a gas station wants to put in an EV charger, they'll call up Drive Electric Vermont, to figure out how to do it. So they do all those kinds of things for us. That's where the 2 million over 3 years would go.
Yes.
Drive Electric give us a new, one of those charts, that green chart that they did,
Yes.
especially with the $45,000 cap.
Yes.
If Dave is listening, he could send us the letter.
I wanted to go to line 17, Anthea. May use up to 15% of any single authorization. That's a different term. We've used total grants, we've used appropriation. What 15% of any single authorization? What is authorization referring to?
So
I'm on page 14, line 17.
I believe all of the language in the T-bill is using the phrasing authorization, and that's because the T-bill doesn't actually appropriate any money. So while there's $12 million authorized for the incentive program for new PEVs, it's only available for that purpose if it is appropriated in the big bill. So I believe the authorization language is used consistently, but the difference is going to be in the use of the amount of grants awarded. And the reason why it's not used amount of grants awarded here is because all of these programs are grant programs, incentive programs, as opposed to the possibility that for the charging stations, it would be the administration purchasing them or entering into a contract through a public-private partnership for them.
I want to know of any single authorization subsection A through E. So we're talking about
All of those amounts. So the authorization.
and so A is 12 million, and
Yep.
then the rest are how the
No, that's 12
it's 12
million.
million. So it's you can use up to 15% of the 12 million and 15% of the 3 million and the 3 million. That's all I wanted to
You got it.
understand.
Yeah, and these amounts, it's not a cumulative summing to 12 million. It's 12 million for this, 3 million for that, 3 million for this, and then the 1 million. So if you're summing that all, you're going to be at $20 million.
Okay. That's all I wanted to understand, how that was. Oh, 20 million, so 15%, up to 15% of 20 million then in total, but it's single at each of the individual, so.
Go ahead.
And Michelle, would you guys be okay with that $2 million, since it is sort of different than administration expenses? Calling that out specifically, it says, because if you know it's going to be 2 million, do you know how many years?
So we were anticipating 3 years based on the ARPA framework, and it would be fine if you want to place a reference in there. So when we go back and forth, as we go forward in time, it'll be clear. So maybe Anthea can figure it out.
Yeah, and at least if the committee didn't care, I would like to see that as a, new subsection where we just call that out separately.
So I will say that this was drafted with the 2 million included as part of administration expenses, in part to try and have it fit under ARPA. If you think about the purpose of ARPA money is having the promotion of electric vehicles, what's the link there to travel, tourism, hospitality as an impacted industry or low and moderate income households? If you're using general fund, then you don't have to try and make the connection. I think it would be very easy to pull out the 2 million for Drive Electric, specify the timeframe that that's intended to be used for the public-private partnership, and keep it as a different subsection entirely from the balance of the administration expenses at the 15% of authorization or whatever you choose to have it be.
And maybe Senator Kitchell's already touched on this, and I want to go back to it. I don't mean to backtrack, but these programs are already established, and we're just adding money to them. And it takes 15% to spend that money down. It takes that much more. Percentage-wise to spend that type of money.
Yeah, because you've got staff that are processing applications and determining the amount of grant awards, for example, the vehicle subsidy and stuff.
Not always, is it?
So
Okay.
any benefit program usually has a 10 to 15%, particularly because of the staffing and the work and the
So the Clean
material.
Energy Development Fund is limited to 5%.
Well, that's because you're so efficient.
Yeah, exactly.
Personally.
It's true. No, it
You
is.
are.
Have you
I-
gone by with 5%, or is that?
We made it work.
So what we have here is an authorization, and then it's referencing a specific appropriation in the big bill. And so
Okay.
we've got to make sure that when we pass the T-bill, the budget still keeps that $2 million.
I feel very confident that Chris and the other folks at JFO are going to track the two and make
I'm
sure
sure
that they
they
stay
will.
aligned.
Okay, why don't we got a long morning. Why don't we take a 15-minute break right now? And we'll be back at 10:30, if that's all right with everybody? Okay, Manthea, 15